Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. Today we're going to talk about both recording and mixing as it pertains to frequencies. We see all these different frequency ranges here. I've talked about the ranges before: low, low, mid, mid, high, mid, and high. And I like to view these as different buckets into which I put tracks. But we've talked about it in the context of mixing, but I also want to talk about it in the context of recording and production, because these play into my decisions when I'm recording things as much as when I'm mixing. So it all kind of mushes together, but that'll make more sense. So what we're going to do today is, this is our session. This is our blank slate. We've opened up our recording software and there's nothing recorded. So one thing to think about is, if you think about the way we make music, recording, okay, when we're actually putting the song together, is additive. And for me, at least, not everyone, but for me, I think of mixing as subtractive. So when I record, I'm starting with nothing and adding things in, and those things will fill up these different frequency ranges. When I'm mixing, generally, I'm taking some things away so it all works together. That will make more sense here in a minute. Let's dive into what I want to talk about. So we're going to build out a kind of typical rock song instrumentation here. Obviously, your instruments may vary, but you'll get the idea. So first, let's start off with kick drum. Where does kick drum live? Well, obviously, kick drum lives in the lows, and kick drum also lives in the low mids. You can make a case for a little bit up here for the tick, tick, tick of the kick drum, but we're talking kind of primarily where they reside when we record them, okay? So we're starting out there. Next, let's actually get the drums out of the way first. Snare drum. Snare drum lives in a few different places. It definitely has some low mid, depending on the tone of the snare. It definitely has some high mid. So you got this, but you also have this boom, so I say it fills up both. I like it to have some thickness and some top end. Keeping with the drum theme, where do cymbals live? Well, cymbals live up in the high mids, like the hi-hats and things like that, and then the brightness of the cymbals is up in the highs, okay? So just with, actually, let's do one more. Now, bass guitar. Where does bass live? Well, bass lives very similar to kick drum, correct? Bass got some lows there, and we got some low mids in the bass. It does hang out up here as well, but we're talking kind of where the primary sound is on these instruments. So just now, if we put together a killer drum and bass mix, we've got almost everything covered. The mids are empty, and you'll see that that's kind of one of the reasons why we love to mix things like guitars and vocals with things like drums and bass, because there's at least one big chunk in the middle that doesn't really overlap very much. All right, so let's go into instruments. For me, the next instrument I would put in would be something like acoustic guitar. Probably as a scratch track, might be the first thing I record. Acoustic guitar definitely has some mid-range, has some high mids. It actually has a little bit of high end, that high kind of pickly sound of the pick on the guitar, and it most certainly has some low mids. If you've ever wrestled with a muddy acoustic guitar, you know what I'm talking about. All right, let's say this starts off as more of a chill song, so we want to throw in some piano. Well, piano is similar frequency-wise to acoustic guitar, so we're going to throw piano in the mids, the high mids, and also in the low mids. You can see things are already starting to stack up. The low mids are starting to become a problem. All right, let's say we get cute and we're like, I want to make this more pop, so I'm going to throw in some synths, like some buzzy synth sounds. But that's definitely going to have some high mids to it, and it's going to fill out the mid-range as well. Okay, so now we've got, you can see we filled up the mids pretty quickly. Now electric guitar. Where's electric guitar live? Well, electric guitar certainly lives, okay, out of the way here, certainly lives in the high mids, but it also lives in the mids and the low mids as well. So we got to give electric guitar some props in both of these areas, okay? Now, what if we throw in a sick lead part? Now, for the most part, the lead is going to live up here in the high mids, right? It's got that sharp cutting through frequency, so we'll put that there. All right, we're getting pretty close to being done with this production. What's next? Well, vocals for sure. Vocals are probably the biggest range. There's a little bit of high bit of air on the vocals. There's definitely some upper mid-range, that kind of nasal frequency that you need to be there, but sometimes can be too much, and there's definitely some low mids because vocals can be warm. And then what's next? Background vocals. Well, background vocals definitely have some mids. They definitely have some high mids, at least the way I like to record them, and they definitely have some highs because there's that kind of bright airiness there. Whew, okay, so we've got a song here that we've recorded. What do you notice? I ran out of space, but if we could like stack these up a little bit more, you'd notice there's a lot of buildup in the low mids and a whole lot of buildup in the high mids. What does this mean? This means if you were to record all these parts, getting the tones you want for them, but you didn't touch them with EQ or compression or anything like that, and you pulled up a session and you were ready to mix, just setting the levels for everything, your mix would probably sound like, if I could draw it, like this EQ curve here. Like a whole lot of low mids, a whole lot of high mids, and then some highs. Okay? And then the natural inclination when you get there is to say, man, this mix doesn't have as much low end as I want, so we grab our low EQ and we try to push it up to get it to match everything else. When I would argue that it's better to take some of the high mid frequencies out, some of those low mid frequencies out, because the kick and bass are rocking on their own. We don't need to necessarily boost this too much. It's more of a matter of getting these under control. Does that make sense? So it's definitely a function of mixing, because we don't want this to necessarily be flat, but we do want it to be balanced. We don't want there to be way more high mids than anything else in our mix. So we're going to use both volumes and EQs to make sure this doesn't get out of hand and we end up with a very harsh mix. We also don't want whole lot of these frequencies over here, or we end up with a muddy mix. We've all been there. I think these are the two extremes we tend to kind of waffle between, especially when we're starting out with mixing. And when you think about it from a production standpoint, we also don't want to record. I was doing a critique recently where everything was recorded with mostly high mids in the recording itself. The guitars were all bright with no mid-range or warmth. The vocal was all upper mid-range with no. So it was even more built up here, and it was like we took all these pages away. So the mix was missing these two very important ranges. It's important to remember that none of these ranges are good or bad. It's just when there's one of them is missing. If we took our mids out, this mix would sound funky. But if we also had everything here in the mids, it would sound kind of like that. And that's funky too. So we don't need to get rid of any range. We also don't need to have too much of a range. It's all about the magic word, right? Balance. Now, it may look like there's not enough low end, but probably a more accurate kick drum and bass are just so massive because they carry so much low frequency information that it probably makes more sense to give them a big old sticky, because that's how much energy they take up. So something like this is probably more accurate. So now you can see we got a good chunk here, got a lot of build up here. This could probably go higher. This definitely goes higher, and the mids are kind of hanging out okay, and the highs are okay. Does that make sense? Think about that next time you are either recording or mixing. 'Cause I think you'll find, even if you're deciding, what do I need to record? Maybe you've got just drums, bass, and guitar, and you realize as you're listening, it kind of sounds like this. I'm hearing all these other ranges, but it's lacking any detail here. So maybe I throw some brighter electric guitars in and maybe a synth part to give me more information there, to add in what we're missing there. Because remember, like I said before, I threw the sheet on the floor, the recording process is where we're adding things. That's where it gets additive. Then we can take some frequencies away if it starts to build up too much during the mixing phase. Same thing here, if the mix feels thin and you don't have anybody living down here but say kick and bass, then you could maybe throw in some lower piano parts that fill it out, some warmer electric guitar parts, maybe make the vocal nice and warm or get a nice warm acoustic guitar. Those are kind of the decisions you can make. So these are both applicable to the recording phase and the mixing phase, and that's what I love so much about this. It's almost like a puzzle. I mean, look at it. We've got a bunch of pieces on there. We got to make sure we get all the pieces in the right place. All right, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful for you, maybe opened your eyes or even just got you excited to get back in the studio and make some music. If you are into mixing and you haven't already checked out my 5-step mix guide, you can get that at www.5stepmix.com. It's free. It'll walk you through my 5-step mix process, which takes all these jumbles of tracks and makes some sense of them to put them into a final mix. All right, that's it from me. Thanks for watching. Oh boy, it's all messed up. See you in the next one.